The gunshot shattered the mountain stillness as Virginia Elliott steadied her trembling hand, the smoking revolver still pointed at the wooden target she'd erected behind her family's homestead. Tears blurred her vision, but she wouldn't allow them to fall, not anymore. 3 years of grief had hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a shell of the vibrant young woman she'd once been. At 22, she'd already known more loss than most faced in a lifetime, and on this crisp autumn morning in 1878, she made a solemn vow to herself. Her heart was closed for good. The Colorado Territory had taken everything from her parents to typhoid fever, her younger brother to a mining accident, and finally, her fiancé Thomas to a gang of ruthless outlaws just 3 days before their wedding. The small ranch her father had built now stood as both her sanctuary and her prison, a place where Virginia could hide from a world that had proven itself too cruel to bear. She fired again, the bullet splintering the center of the target. Her aim was improving. It had to. A woman alone in these parts needed more than just prayers to survive. "Not bad shooting," came a deep voice from behind her. Virginia spun around, her revolver instinctively aimed at the stranger's chest. He sat atop a chestnut stallion at the edge of her property, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky. His dark hair curled slightly beneath a well-worn cowboy hat, and despite having a gun pointed at his heart, his lips curved into an easy smile. "State your business or get off my land," Virginia demanded, her finger hovering near the trigger. The stranger raised his hands slowly. "Preston Nichols, madam. Just passing through and thought I'd check if you needed any help. Saw the smoke from your chimney." "I don't need help," she replied coldly, "especially not from some drifter." His smile didn't falter. "Fair enough. Though I should mention your south fence is down in 3 places. Coyotes could get at your livestock." Virginia's jaw tightened. She'd noticed the fence last week, but hadn't found the time to repair it between managing the crops, tending the animals, and keeping outlaws at bay. Still, she wasn't about to admit weakness to a stranger. "I'm aware," she said. "I'll handle it." Preston Nichols nodded, lowering his hands slowly. "I'm sure you will, miss. Elliott, Virginia Elliott." The name left her lips before she could think better of it. "Miss Elliott," he repeated, tipping his hat. "I'll be in town for a spell working at the Callahan Ranch. Should you change your mind about that fence, you know where to find me." As he turned his horse to leave, Virginia called out, "What makes you think I'd trust you?" He looked back, that steady smile still in place, though his eyes held something deeper, something that made Virginia's chest tighten uncomfortably. "I don't expect trust, Miss Elliott. Not right away. But everyone needs a helping hand sometimes, even the strongest among us." She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. Only when he disappeared from view did she lower her gun, her hand inexplicably shaking more than before. Virginia returned to the cabin, slamming the door behind her as if to keep out not just the cold autumn air but the memory of that smile. She had work to do, endless work, and no time for mysterious cowboys with kind eyes and presumptuous offers of help. By evening, Virginia's back ached from hauling water and chopping wood. She sat at her small kitchen table, a cold stew before her that she couldn't summon the appetite to eat. The cabin felt cavernous around her, each creak and groan a reminder of its emptiness. She thought of the stranger Preston Nichols and his offer. The Callahan Ranch was respectable enough. Old man Callahan was fair in his dealings, though she'd had little interaction with him since her father's passing. "I don't need help," she whispered to herself, the words echoing hollow in the quiet room. But as night fell and the wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls, Virginia knew she was lying to herself. The truth was she needed help desperately, she just couldn't bear to admit it. The following morning brought gray skies and a biting chill. Virginia bundled herself against the cold and headed out to check her small herd of cattle. As she crested the hill overlooking the south pasture, she stopped short. There, working steadily at her broken fence, was Preston Nichols. She marched down the hill, fury building with each step. By the time she reached him, her cheeks were flushed with both cold and anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Preston looked up, seemingly unsurprised by her appearance. "Good morning to you too, Miss Elliott." "Beautiful day, isn't it? You're trespassing?" "I'm fixing your fence," he corrected, driving another post into the ground. "Free of charge." Virginia crossed her arms. "I didn't ask for your help." "No," he agreed amiably, "you didn't. But your cattle were mighty close to wandering off, and that would be a shame." She glanced toward her small herd, indeed grazing dangerously close to the broken section. "I was going to fix it today. Now you don't have to." He hammered the post securely, then straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You can thank me by accepting this as neighborly kindness, nothing more." Virginia wanted to argue further, to order him off her property, but the sight of the half-repaired fence stopped her. It would have taken her days to complete the work he'd accomplished in a morning. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why help a stranger?" Something flashed in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or shared pain. "Because when my family lost everything in the war, strangers helped us rebuild." "I'm just passing on the kindness." The simple honesty in his words disarmed her. Virginia looked away, uncomfortable with the emotion rising in her throat. "Fine, finish the fence, but this doesn't mean I owe you anything. Wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise, Miss Elliott." The smile was back, warm and steady as a heartbeat. She turned to leave, then paused. "There's coffee on the stove if you want some. It's probably cold by now." It wasn't much of an olive branch, but it was all she could manage. Before he could respond, she hurried back toward the cabin, unsettled by the faint flutter in her chest that felt disturbingly like hope. The days that followed fell into an unexpected pattern. Each morning, Virginia would wake to find Preston already at work somewhere on her property, mending the chicken coop, reinforcing the barn doors, clearing the irrigation channels to her small vegetable garden. She never asked for his help, yet couldn't bring herself to send him away. They rarely spoke beyond brief exchanges about the work at hand, but his presence gradually became less intrusive, almost comfortable. He always departed before noon, returning to his duties at the Callahan Ranch, leaving Virginia to her solitude with both relief and a curious emptiness she refused to examine. On the fifth day, as Preston was repairing a leak in her roof, Virginia finally broached the subject that had been troubling her. "Mr. Nichols," she called up to him, "I can't pay you for your work." He peered down from his perch. "Did I ask for payment?" "No, but then there's no problem." He returned to his task, hammering a new shingle into place. Virginia frowned. "There is a problem. I don't understand what you're getting from this arrangement." Preston set down his hammer and climbed carefully down the ladder. When he reached the ground, he stood before her, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Miss Elliott, not everything in this world is about getting something in return. Sometimes people just do kind things because they can." "Not in my experience," she replied, the words bitter on her tongue. His expression softened. "Then you've met the wrong people." Before she could formulate a response, he glanced at the position of the sun. "I should head back. Old man Callahan's expecting me to help with the new horses." He gathered his tools, then hesitated. "Tomorrow's Sunday. I won't be by in the morning." Virginia told herself the pang she felt wasn't disappointment. "Of course, you have the day off." "Actually, I'll be at church in town. Would you like to join me?" The invitation caught her completely off guard. Virginia hadn't set foot in church since her parents' funeral, hadn't ventured into town except for absolute necessities. "I don't think so," she said quickly. "I have too much to do here." Preston nodded, accepting her refusal without question. "Another time, perhaps." He tipped his hat and walked toward his horse, tethered near the water trough. As he mounted, Virginia found herself calling after him. "Mr. Nichols." He turned in the saddle, eyebrows raised expectantly. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling strange and rusty in her mouth. "For the roof." His smile brightened his entire face. "You're welcome, Miss Elliott. See you Monday." Virginia watched him ride away, a strange mixture of emotions churning within her. When she turned back to the cabin, she caught sight of her reflection in the window glass and was startled to see the ghost of a smile on her own lips. Sunday passed slowly, each hour dragging into the next as Virginia threw herself into work that couldn't quite distract her from thoughts of Preston Nichols. She told herself it was merely gratitude she felt, perhaps even friendship, but nothing more. Her heart was sealed shut, the key thrown away the day they'd buried Thomas. Monday morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of rain. Virginia woke earlier than usual, finding herself glancing repeatedly toward the road as she went about her morning chores. By 9 o'clock, with no sign of Preston, she felt both foolish and inexplicably bereft. "He's not coming," she muttered to herself, forcefully plunging her hands into the washtub where her few clothes soaked. "And it doesn't matter one bit." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart leap traitorously. She kept her head down, pretending absorption in her task as Preston's horse trotted into the yard. Only when his boots crunched on the gravel nearby did she look up. "You're late," she said, immediately regretting the accusatory tone if Preston noticed he didn't show it. "Had to help with a difficult foaling at Callahan's. Mother and colt are doing fine now." His usual smile was in place, though shadows under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night. Virginia nodded, softening despite herself. "There's fresh coffee inside if you want some, and bread from yesterday." His expression brightened. "That sounds mighty fine, Miss Elliott, thank you." As they sat at her small table, an awkward silence fell between them. Virginia realized this was the first time they'd shared a meal, the first time Preston had been invited properly into her home rather than just passing through on his way to some repair. "How long have you been at Callahan's?" she asked finally, desperate to break the silence. "Just over a month. Came up from Texas with a cattle drive and decided to stay on a while." He sipped his coffee appreciatively. "This is good, real good." "My mother's recipe," Virginia said, then fell silent again, memories washing over her. Preston seemed to sense her withdrawal. "I lost my mother too," he said quietly. 10 years ago now, still miss her every day." Virginia looked up, meeting his gaze. "Does it get easier, the missing them part?" He considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "Not easier exactly, different. Less like a knife and more like an old injury that aches when rain's coming." He glanced out the window at the gathering clouds. "Speaking of which." A low rumble of thunder punctuated his words. Virginia rose to clear their cups, uncomfortable with the intimacy of shared grief. "If you're staying to work today, you'd better get started before the storm hits," she said, her tone deliberately brisk. Preston stood, recognizing her retreat. "Yes, madam. I was thinking of reinforcing that old shed near the east field. Looks about ready to collapse in a strong wind." "That would be—" Virginia hesitated. "That would be helpful, thank you." He nodded and headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Miss Elliott?" "Yes. For what it's worth, I think you're doing remarkably well, managing all this on your own. Your family would be proud." The words hit her like a physical blow, cracking something in her chest that she'd worked so hard to keep intact. Before she could respond, Preston slipped outside, leaving her alone with the thundering of her heart and the first drops of rain pattering against the window. The storm unleashed its fury shortly after noon, forcing Preston to abandon his work on the shed and dash for the barn. Virginia watched from the cabin window as he led his horse inside for shelter, then turned her attention back to the mending in her lap. The rain showed no signs of letting up, trapping them both on the property for the foreseeable future. An hour later, a knock at the door startled her from her work. She opened it to find Preston standing there, soaked to the skin despite the short distance from barn to cabin. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, water dripping from his hat brim. "But I found something in your barn you might want to see." Curiosity overrode Virginia's reluctance to venture into the downpour. She grabbed her oilskin coat and followed Preston across the muddy yard to the barn. Inside, nestled in a makeshift bed of straw, lay a mother cat with 5 tiny kittens, no more than a few days old. She must have come in seeking shelter before the rain, Preston explained, crouching beside the feline family. The little ones look healthy, but the mother's mighty thin. Virginia knelt beside him, her heart softening at the sight of the tiny creatures. The mother cat watched them warily, but didn't flee as Virginia cautiously extended her hand. "She's starving," Virginia murmured, feeling the cat's protruding ribs beneath her matted fur. "She can't feed the kittens properly like this." Without hesitation, she rose and hurried back to the cabin, returning minutes later with a small bowl of milk and some scraps of leftover chicken. The mother cat sniffed the offerings suspiciously, then began to eat with desperate hunger. "You've made a friend for life," Preston observed, smiling as he watched the cat. Virginia found herself smiling back. "It's been a while since I've had animals that weren't for practical purposes." "Every creature has its purpose," Preston said, gently stroking one of the kittens with a single finger. "These little ones will make fine mousers once they're grown." Virginia nodded, but found herself wondering if that was truly why the sight of the cat family affected her so deeply. Perhaps it was simply the miracle of new life in the midst of a world that had seemed so barren for so long. They sat in companionable silence as the rain drummed on the roof, the storm's fury gradually diminishing to a steady downpour. When the mother cat finished eating and curled protectively around her kittens, Virginia and Preston retreated to a bench along the barn wall. "Will you keep them?" Preston asked. Virginia considered the question. "I suppose I will. The barn could use some good mousers, as you said." Preston smiled, that steady, unwavering smile that somehow reached all the way to his eyes. "They'll need names." "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "Well, the mother looks like a duchess to me, regal despite her circumstances." Virginia looked at the bedraggled cat, now contentedly grooming her kittens, and found herself laughing. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed and almost painful but genuine. "Duchess it is, then?" Preston's expression turned serious, though his eyes remained warm. "That's a beautiful sound, your laugh. You should use it more often." The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken emotion. Virginia looked away first, rising abruptly from the bench. "The rain's letting up," she observed, though it was still falling steadily. "You should be able to return to Callahan's soon." If Preston was hurt by her sudden withdrawal, he didn't show it. "Yes, I reckon so, though I'd appreciate borrowing a dry shirt for the ride if you've got one that might fit." Virginia hesitated, then nodded. "I have some of my father's things. They might be a bit small on you, but drier than what you're wearing now." Back in the cabin, Virginia retrieved one of her father's shirts from the chest where she kept the few possessions she couldn't bear to part with. The fabric still held a faint trace of his scent, and for a moment she clutched it to her chest, memories threatening to overwhelm her. "Miss Elliott," Preston's voice came from the doorway. "I can make do with what I have if it's too difficult." She turned, composing herself with effort. "No, it's fine. Here." She handed him the shirt, careful not to let their fingers touch. "You can change in the back room." When he emerged minutes later, Virginia caught her breath. Her father had been a tall man, but Preston filled out the shirt in ways her father never had, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric tight. Seeing him in her father's clothes created a strange intimacy that Virginia wasn't prepared for. "I'm obliged," Preston said, folding his wet shirt neatly. "I'll return this cleaned and pressed next time I come." Virginia nodded, unable to formulate a response past the unexpected tightness in her throat. Outside, the rain had indeed slowed to a gentle mist. Preston retrieved his horse from the barn, pausing to check on the cats one last time before mounting. "I'll bring some proper milk for them tomorrow," he promised, settling into his saddle. "You don't have to keep coming," Virginia said suddenly. "You've already done more than enough around here." Preston studied her face, his expression unreadable. "Would you prefer I didn't return, Miss Elliott?" The question hung in the damp air between them. Virginia knew the sensible answer, the safe answer, was yes, yet the word wouldn't come. "I just don't want you to feel obligated," she said finally. His smile returned, gentle as the rain. "There's not a trace of obligation in my coming here, Virginia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her veins. "Then I'll see you tomorrow, Preston," she replied, testing his name on her tongue and finding it fit there comfortably. He tipped his hat, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Until tomorrow." As he rode away through the misty afternoon, Virginia stood watching long after he disappeared from sight. The strange warmth lingered in her chest, frightening in its unfamiliarity after years of carefully cultivated numbness. In the barn, Duchess began to purr as Virginia checked on the little family one last time. The sound was soothing, a reminder that life continued to unfold in unexpected ways, even when one had resolved to stop living it fully. That night, for the first time in years, Virginia dreamed not of loss and loneliness, but of steady hands and a smile that promised shelter from the storm. The following weeks brought crisp autumn days and increasingly frequent visits from Preston. What had begun as brief morning work sessions gradually expanded, with Preston often staying through lunch and into the afternoon. Virginia found herself planning meals with more care, taking extra time with her appearance each morning, then berating herself for such foolishness. The kittens grew quickly under their watchful eyes, becoming adventurous little creatures that tumbled about the barn and provided endless entertainment. Watching Preston with the animals gentle, patient, always mindful of their mother's protective instincts revealed a tenderness that made Virginia's carefully constructed walls tremble. One golden afternoon in late October, as they sat on the porch shelling the last of the season's peas, Preston broke their comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Will you tell me about Thomas?" Virginia's hands stilled, the pea pod she'd been opening dropping forgotten to her lap. "How do you know about Thomas?" Preston's expression was apologetic but resolute. "Small towns have long memories and longer tongues. I heard about your loss at the general store last week." Virginia looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "There's nothing to tell, he died. End of story." "I don't believe that," Preston said quietly. "No one's story ends with their death, not for those left behind." His perception cut too close to Virginia's carefully buried pain. She stood abruptly, scattering peas across the porch boards. "You don't know anything about it." "I know loss, Virginia." Preston's voice remained steady, neither challenging nor placating. "Different than yours, but deep enough to recognize its shape in another person." "And what good does talking about it do?" she demanded. "Will it bring him back? Will it change anything at all?" Preston stood, facing her with that unwavering gaze that seemed to see straight through her defenses. "No, but carrying it alone doesn't honor his memory either." "Don't you dare speak of honor to me," Virginia snapped, anger flaring hot and protective around her grief. "Thomas died trying to stop a robbery, shot in the back by cowards who were never caught, never punished. Where's the honor in that?" As soon as the words left her mouth, Virginia regretted them. Not because they weren't true, but because speaking them aloud made the reality of Thomas's senseless death fresh again, reopening a wound she'd thought long scarred over. To her horror, tears began to spill down her cheeks, the first she'd allowed herself in over a year. She turned away, desperate to hide this weakness, but Preston's gentle hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Virginia," he said softly, "look at me." Reluctantly, she turned, expecting pity in his eyes. Instead, she found only compassion and a sorrow that mirrored her own. "I lost my wife and daughter in a raid on our homestead in Kansas," he said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his expression. 3 years ago now, militiamen though they called themselves lawmen, I was away, trading in town. Came home to find everything gone them, our home, our future." Virginia stared at him, speechless in the face of his revelation. In all their conversations, he'd never once mentioned a wife, let alone a child. "Her name was Sarah," Preston continued. "Our daughter was Elizabeth. She was 4 years old and loved buttercups and singing made-up songs about clouds." A smile touched his lips, sad but genuine. Sarah used to say Elizabeth got her imagination from me, though Lord knows where I got mine. I'm sorry, Virginia whispered, the words hopelessly inadequate. Preston nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. For a long time, I couldn't speak their names without feeling like I was being torn in half, couldn't remember them without remembering how they died. But that's not living, Virginia, and it's certainly not honoring them. How? She asked, her voice breaking on the single word. How do you bear it? One day at a time, he answered simply. Some days better than others. I started by just saying their names out loud each morning, then telling one memory, one good thing I remembered about them. It hurt like hell at first, but gradually. The knife becomes an old injury, Virginia finished for him, recalling his words from weeks before. He smiled, a trace of his usual steadiness returning. Exactly so. Virginia wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Thomas loved to read, she said, the words emerging hesitantly. Poetry, if you can believe it. This big, strong blacksmith who could shoe the wildest horses in the territory, and at night he'd read Wordsworth by lamplight. Preston's smile deepened. A man of hidden depths. Yes, Virginia agreed, finding that speaking of Thomas brought not just pain but a warm fondness she'd almost forgotten. He was. They stood together as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. Virginia felt lighter somehow, as if sharing even that small piece of Thomas had redistributed the weight she'd carried for so long. Thank you, she said finally, for telling me about Sarah and Elizabeth. Preston's hand found hers, his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller ones with gentle strength. Thank you for listening, and for telling me about Thomas. That evening, after Preston had ridden back to Callahan's, Virginia sat alone by the fire, a book of Wordsworth's poetry open on her lap. She read the familiar verses aloud, her voice growing stronger with each line, allowing herself to remember not just Thomas's death, but his life and her own. The first snowfall of the season arrived in early November, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Virginia woke to a transformed world, the familiar contours of her property rendered new and mysterious beneath the snow. She had just stoked the fire when an urgent knock came at the door. She opened it to find Preston, his hat and shoulders dusted with snow, his expression grave. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Nothing yet, he answered, but there's a proper blizzard coming. Old man Callahan sent me to warn you, says it looks to be the worst in years. Virginia frowned, glancing at the clear blue sky. It seems calm enough now. That's how they fool you. Storms building over the mountains, you can see the clouds if you look west. Callahan says we have maybe 6 hours before it hits. The seriousness in his tone convinced her where his words might not have. Virginia had witnessed Colorado blizzards before, had lost livestock to them despite her father's precautions. What do we need to do? She asked, already reaching for her coat. Preston's expression softened with approval at her quick acceptance of the danger. Get your animals secured, water and feed stored where they can reach it. Then stockpile enough wood and provisions in the cabin to last at least 3 days. They worked swiftly, methodically preparing the property for the coming storm. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had indeed begun to mass on the western horizon, and the wind carried a biting chill that penetrated even the warmest clothing. As they finished bringing in the last armload of firewood, the first flurries began to fall, not the gentle, drifting flakes of the previous night, but hard-driven pellets carried on an increasingly violent wind. You should head back to Callahan's, Virginia said, watching the rapidly deteriorating conditions with concern. Preston shook his head. Too late for that. The pass will already be drifting over. Virginia's heart raced with a mixture of alarm and something that felt dangerously like anticipation. Then you'll have to stay here. He met her eyes steadily. If that's acceptable to you. A gust of wind howled around the cabin corners as if emphasizing the necessity of his remaining. Virginia nodded, hoping the flush in her cheeks could be attributed to the cold. Of course. I can't send you out in this. Come inside before we both freeze. The storm descended in earnest as darkness fell, transforming the peaceful snowfall into a howling maelstrom that rattled the cabin windows and sent snow sifting through every tiny crack in the walls. Virginia added extra logs to the fire, grateful for Preston's insistence on overstocking the woodpile. "Your father built this place solid," Preston observed, returning from checking that the door was securely barred. "Should weather the storm just fine." Virginia nodded, busying herself with preparing a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and cornbread. She was acutely aware of Preston's presence in the small cabin, of the unprecedented intimacy of sharing her home with him not for a brief visit, but for the duration of the storm, possibly days. They ate by firelight, the kerosene lamp conserved for essential use. The dancing flames cast shifting shadows across Preston's features, softening the strong lines of his jaw and brow. "Tell me about Texas," Virginia said, seeking safe conversation to fill the silence between wind gusts. "I've never been farther east than Denver," Preston smiled, setting aside his empty plate. "Texas is beautiful in its own way, different from here, more space between the sky and earth, if that makes sense. Great sweeping plains that make a man feel simultaneously significant and utterly inconsequential." "You miss it," he considered the question thoughtfully. "Parts of it, the wildflowers in spring, the way thunderstorms roll across the plains, visible for hours before they reach you." He paused, his expression growing distant. "But Texas holds ghosts for me too, coming north." It was a chance to start fresh. Virginia understood that sentiment all too well, though her own attempt at starting fresh had involved retreating from the world rather than venturing into new territories. "And have you?" she asked quietly. Started fresh, his gaze returned to her face, warm and steady in the firelight. "I'm beginning to think so." The simple words carried a weight of meaning that made Virginia's breath catch. She looked away, suddenly needing distance from the emotion in his eyes. "I should check on Duchess and the kittens," she said, rising abruptly. "Make sure the barn is secure." Preston stood as well. "I'll come with you. 2 is safer than 1 in this weather." The short journey from cabin to barn was a battle against elements intent on driving them to the ground. They reached the barn door half frozen despite their layers, and it took both their strength to force it open against the drifting snow. Inside, the animals greeted them with nervous whinnies and moos, disturbed by the storm's fury. Virginia quickly located Duchess and her kittens in their customary nest, the mother cat purring reassuringly to her brood despite the alarming sounds outside. "They're fine," Preston said, checking the water troughs for the larger animals. "Everything's secure here." Virginia nodded, relieved, but as they prepared to venture back to the cabin, a particularly violent gust shook the barn, sending a supporting beam crashing down just feet from where they stood. Preston reacted instantly, pulling Virginia against his chest and away from the falling debris. For a moment they stood frozen in the aftermath, hearts racing, bodies pressed together in the shadowy barn. "Are you hurt?" Preston asked, his voice rough with concern. Virginia shook her head, suddenly intensely aware of his arms around her, of the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, of his heartbeat thundering beneath her ear. "I'm fine," she managed, though she made no move to pull away. Preston's hand came up to stroke her hair, a gesture so gentle it nearly undid her. "That was too close," he murmured. "We should check the rest of the structure before we leave." Reluctantly, Virginia stepped back, immediately missing his warmth as the barn's chill enveloped her again. Together they examined the fallen beam, discovering that age and previous water damage had weakened it rather than the current storm. "The rest seems sound," Preston concluded after a thorough inspection. "But we should return to the cabin while we can. This storm's only getting worse." They secured the barn doors and battled their way back through the blinding snow to the cabin. Once inside, Virginia busied herself building up the fire while Preston shook the snow from their coats and hung them to dry. The wind's howl seemed to intensify as night deepened, a wild counterpoint to the crackling fire. Virginia found herself moving closer to Preston on the hearth rug, drawn to his steady presence in the midst of nature's chaos. Will the animals truly be safe? She asked, voicing the worry that had followed her from the barn. Preston nodded. The barn is solid despite that one beam, and animals have instincts for these things. They'll huddle together for warmth. Virginia smiled faintly. Like us. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of boundaries crossed, of possibilities opening. Virginia, Preston began, his voice low and serious. I want you to know that I'll sleep on the floor tonight. Your reputation, she laughed softly, surprising herself. My reputation, Preston, we're in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard. Besides, I stopped caring about town gossip the day I buried Thomas. His expression remained earnest. I care, not about gossip, but about you, about your good name. The simple declaration touched Virginia deeply. Thank you. But truly the floor is too cold, especially tonight. The bed is large enough for both of us, and we're both adults. Preston searched her face, then nodded slowly. If you're certain, I am. And she was, though her certainty came with a flutter of nervous anticipation she hadn't felt in years. As they prepared for bed, observing the awkward dance of two people unaccustomed to sharing such intimate space, Virginia found herself studying Preston covertly, the careful way he moved, always giving her space, always respectful. When they finally lay side by side beneath the quilts, a proper distance between them despite the bed's limited size, the storm seemed to retreat to a distant backdrop, overwhelmed by the thundering of her own heart. Good night, Virginia, Preston said softly into the darkness. Good night, she whispered back, certain that sleep would elude her with him so near. Yet somehow, lulled by the storm's rhythm and Preston's steady breathing, Virginia drifted into the most peaceful slumber she'd known since Thomas's death. She woke to pale light filtering through frost-covered windows and the realization that during the night they had gravitated toward each other. Preston's arm lay across her waist, her head nestled against his shoulder. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, absorbing the unfamiliar sensation of being held, of feeling protected rather than being the protector. Preston stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. Instead of embarrassment or hasty retreat, his lips curved into that now familiar steady smile. Good morning, he said simply. Good morning, she replied, making no move to pull away. Outside, the storm continued, though with less violence than the previous night. They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the wind, neither willing to break the fragile peace that had enveloped them. Finally, Preston spoke, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. I should check on the animals. Virginia nodded reluctantly. We both should. They rose and dressed warmly, preparing to brave the elements once more. At the door, Preston turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. Virginia, when this storm passes. She waited, heart suspended between beats. When this storm passes, I'd like your permission to call on you properly. Not as a helpful neighbor or a handy worker, but as a man who greatly admires a woman. The words she'd half expected still took her breath away. Virginia looked into his earnest face and felt the final bricks of her carefully constructed wall begin to crumble. I think I'd like that very much, she answered, her voice steadier than she'd expected. His smile blazed bright enough to rival the snow-reflected light. Then let's make sure your homestead survives this blizzard intact. Together they stepped out into the storm, no longer two solitary figures battling separate griefs, but partners facing the elements and the future side by side. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping Virginia and Preston in a world reduced to the cabin, the barn, and the treacherous path between them. Each night they shared the bed, their bodies gradually losing their initial hesitancy, finding comfort in proximity without crossing the boundaries of propriety. Each morning they woke closer together, as if their sleeping selves recognized what their waking minds were only beginning to acknowledge. They talked for hours by firelight about their childhoods, their lost loved ones, their hopes that had withered and the dreams they'd abandoned. Preston spoke of his years drifting after Sarah and Elizabeth's deaths, taking whatever work would keep him moving, afraid to stay in one place long enough to feel again. Virginia confessed her determination to never risk her heart a second time, to grow old alone rather than face another devastating loss. "But you can't really close your heart," Preston observed on the third night, as they sat side by side watching the flames. "Not completely. If you could, you wouldn't care for those kittens so tenderly. You wouldn't have kept this place going when it would have been easier to sell up and move to town." Virginia considered his words. "Perhaps you're right, but caring for animals, for land, that's different. They don't leave you the way people do." "Everyone leaves eventually, Virginia," he said gently. "That's the nature of life. The question is whether the joy of loving them while they're here outweighs the pain of losing them when they're gone." She turned to study his profile, struck by the wisdom in his words. "And what's your answer to that question?" Preston's eyes met hers, their hazel depths reflecting the firelight. "I'm sitting beside you, aren't I, after swearing I'd never risk my heart again." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Virginia felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking up on a river after a long winter, painful in its suddenness, but bringing the promise of flowing water and new life. Before she could respond, a change in the storm's voice drew their attention. The constant howling that had been their companion for days had softened to a gentle susurration. "I think it's passing," Preston said, moving to the window and rubbing a circle in the frost to peer outside. The winds dropped considerably. Virginia joined him, standing close enough that their arms touched as they looked out at the transformed landscape. Moonlight bathed the snow-covered world in silver, the storm clouds retreating to reveal a sky scattered with stars. "It's beautiful," she breathed, the sight momentarily banishing all other thoughts. "Yes," Preston agreed, though when she glanced up, she found him looking not at the snow-clad scenery but at her face. "Beautiful indeed." Dawn brought clear skies and the enormous task of digging out. They worked together to clear paths to the barn and well, to check fences buried under drifts, to ensure that no animals had been lost to the storm's fury. By mid-afternoon, they stood on the newly cleared porch, surveying their handiwork with tired satisfaction. "Your road to town should be passable by tomorrow," Virginia observed, trying to keep her tone neutral despite the pangs she felt at the thought of Preston's departure. He nodded, his expression similarly composed. "Likely so. Though I suspect Callahan will have plenty for me to do, repairing whatever the storm damaged." An awkward silence fell between them, the easy intimacy of their storm-bound days suddenly uncertain in the face of returning to normal life. "Preston," Virginia began, just as he said, "Virginia." They laughed, the tension breaking. Preston gestured for her to continue. "I just wanted to say." She paused, searching for words adequate to express the transformation these days had wrought within her. "Thank you for everything." It wasn't what she'd meant to say at all, but the deeper truth stuck in her throat, too new and fragile for daylight. Preston's smile held a hint of disappointment, but he nodded. "You're welcome, though I should be thanking you for your hospitality." Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Preston squared his shoulders. "I should get back to Callahan's, let him know I'm alive and well. He's probably wondering if I got caught in the storm." "Of course," Virginia agreed quickly. "You should go." He hesitated, then reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "I meant what I said, Virginia, about calling on you properly. If that's still something you'd welcome." Relief flooded through her. "Yes," she said, perhaps too eagerly. "Yes, I'd welcome that." His smile returned in full force, warming her more effectively than the winter sun. "Then I'll be back on Sunday. For dinner, perhaps?" "Sunday," she confirmed, returning his smile. "I'll make a proper roast." Preston squeezed her hand once more before releasing it. "I'll count the hours." As he rode away across the gleaming snow, Virginia watched from the porch, her hand still tingling from his touch. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself looking forward rather than back, anticipating the future instead of dreading it. Inside the cabin, which should have felt empty after his departure, Virginia was surprised to discover lingering warmth, not just physical heat from the fire, but an emotional glow that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. Preston might have left, but he'd somehow managed to leave pieces of himself behind. His steady presence, his gentle understanding, his unwavering smile that promised second chances were not only possible but worth the risk. Virginia touched her lips, remembering how close they'd come to kissing by the fire last night, how she'd turned away at the last moment, fear momentarily overcoming desire. She wouldn't make the same mistake again, she resolved. When Sunday came, she would be brave enough to accept not just his attention but everything he offered. In the meantime, she had work to do, a homestead to run, animals to care for, and a heart to prepare for reopening after years of careful closure. Sunday arrived with agonizing slowness, each day stretching endlessly as Virginia alternated between anticipation and anxiety. She threw herself into preparations, cleaning the cabin until it gleamed, preparing the promised roast with meticulous care, even unpacking a dress she hadn't worn since before Thomas's death. As she arranged her hair before the small mirror, Virginia barely recognized the woman who looked back at her. Color had returned to her cheeks, light to her eyes. She looked, for the first time in years, alive rather than merely existing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing. She smoothed her dress, took a steadying breath, and opened the door before Preston could knock. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, dressed in clothes finer than his usual working attire. In one arm he carried a small bouquet of winter greenery adorned with red berries. "Virginia," he breathed, his eyes traveling over her with undisguised appreciation. "You look lovely." She flushed, unaccustomed to such open admiration. "Thank you. So do you, handsome, I mean, not lovely." Preston's laugh was warm and genuine. "I'll take either compliment gladly." He offered the bouquet. "These aren't much compared to spring flowers, but I thought they might brighten your table." Virginia accepted them with genuine pleasure. "They're perfect. Please come in." Dinner passed in easy conversation, the awkwardness of their parting replaced by a comfortable rapport, enhanced by shared glances and occasional touches, as they passed dishes or reached for bread. Virginia found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn out of her shell by Preston's stories and gentle teasing. As they lingered over coffee, Preston's expression grew more serious. "I've been thinking a great deal this week," he began, "about what happens next." Virginia set down her cup, suddenly nervous. "And what conclusions have you reached?" Preston leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "That I want to court you properly, Virginia Elliott. That these past weeks have shown me it's possible to honor those we've lost while still embracing the future. That my heart, which I thought permanently broken, has somehow found a way to beat strongly again, and it beats for you." The words, so plainly spoken yet so profound, brought tears to Virginia's eyes. "Preston, you don't need to answer now," he interjected gently. "I know your heart has been closed a long time. I'm prepared to be patient, to earn your trust day by day if that's what's needed." Virginia shook her head, impatient not with him but with her own hesitation. "That's just it. You've already earned it, these past weeks. You've shown me what kind of man you are, kind, honorable, steady. The kind of man who fixes fences without being asked and risked a blizzard to warn a stubborn woman living alone." Preston smiled at her characterization. "You're not stubborn, determined perhaps, independent, strong." "All polite words for stubborn," Virginia countered with a smile of her own, then grew serious again. "The truth is, Preston, I'm terrified, not of you but of feeling again, of caring so deeply that losing you would devastate me all over again." "I understand that fear," he said quietly. "I live with it too. But Virginia, what's the alternative? To stop living in order to avoid the pain of loss, that's not really living at all." No, she agreed. It's not. I've been existing, not living, and I don't want to just exist anymore. Preston's eyes brightened with hope. Does that mean? Instead of answering with words, Virginia rose from her chair, rounded the table, and did what she'd been wanting to do for days. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Preston's arms came around her waist, drawing her closer, it deepened into something that sent warmth cascading through her body. When they finally parted, both breathless, Virginia found herself seated in his lap, his forehead resting against hers. "I'll take that as a yes," Preston murmured, a smile in his voice. Virginia laughed softly. "Yes, Preston Nichols. Yes to courting. Yes to whatever comes next. Yes to living again, even with all the risks that entails." His arms tightened around her. "I can't promise there won't be pain ahead, Virginia. Life has taught us both that such promises are empty. But I can promise to face whatever comes beside you, to be as steady and true as I know how to be." "That's all anyone can ask," she replied, then kissed him again, sealing their new understanding with the press of her lips against his. As the winter months passed, Preston became a fixture at Virginia's homestead, spending every free moment away from Callahan's ranch by her side. They worked together through the short days and long nights, repairing what needed fixing, planning spring plantings, caring for the animals. Duchess's kittens, now half-grown, adopted Preston as readily as they had Virginia, climbing his tall frame when he sat by the fire and purring contentedly in his lap. Virginia often found him talking to them as he would to people, explaining whatever task he was engaged in with good-humored patience. "They're cats, not farmhands," she teased one evening, finding him instructing a particularly attentive orange tabby on the finer points of fence mending. Preston grinned, unabashed. "Don't underestimate them. This fellow here has real potential. I'm thinking of naming him Foreman." The casual mention of naming of claiming sent a warm flutter through Virginia's chest. Preston had been careful not to push too fast, respecting her need to adjust gradually to the idea of sharing her life again. But in small ways like this, he made clear his intention to remain. By February, whispers began circulating in town about the handsome cowboy from Texas and the widow Elliott, isolated no longer. Virginia, who once would have bristled at such talk, found she didn't mind. Let them gossip. Their words couldn't touch the quiet joy she'd rediscovered. On Valentine's Day, Preston arrived at the cabin with a small wrapped package and an uncharacteristic nervousness about him. "It's not much," he said as Virginia unwrapped the gift, a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "But when I saw it in Denver last week, I thought of you." Virginia opened the locket to find it empty. She looked up questioningly. "I thought," Preston explained, his voice softening, "that you might want to put a bit of Thomas in there, to keep him close to your heart even as you move forward. And someday, perhaps, there might be room for another memory beside his." Tears welled in Virginia's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture, not just the gift itself, but the understanding behind it. The acknowledgement that her past love remained part of her, even as she opened herself to a new beginning. "It's perfect," she whispered, holding out the locket for him to fasten around her neck. "Thank you." As his fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, a shiver ran down Virginia's spine that had nothing to do with the February chill. "Virginia," Preston began, his voice lower than usual, "there's something else I wanted to discuss with you." She turned to face him, heart quickening at his serious tone. "Yes, old man Callahan's offered me a partnership in the ranch. Says he's getting too old to manage it all himself and has no sons to leave it to. It would mean putting down roots here, making a real home in Colorado." Virginia's breath caught. "And what did you tell him?" "That I needed to talk to you first." Preston took her hands in his. "Because my decision depends entirely on yours." "Mine, Virginia Elliott, these past months have been the happiest of my life since I lost Sarah and Elizabeth. You've brought light back into my world, given me reason to look forward rather than back." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you." I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The declaration, though not entirely unexpected, still sent Virginia's heart racing. "Are you proposing, Preston Nichols?" His steady smile appeared, though nervousness lingered in his eyes. Inelegantly, perhaps, but yes. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife. Not to replace what either of us has lost, but to create something new together." Virginia looked into his beloved face and felt the last of her reservations melt away. The heart she had closed so firmly after Thomas's death now stood fully open, ready to embrace not just Preston but the future they might build together. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Joy transformed Preston's features. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm before capturing her lips in a kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities, of winters weathered together and springs yet to come. Spring arrived early that year, the snow retreating to reveal tender green shoots and the first wildflowers dotting the meadows. Virginia and Preston were married in the small town church on a perfect April morning, with old man Callahan giving the bride away, and Duchess's kittens, now fully grown cats, left in charge of the homestead for the day. Virginia wore a simple cream dress adorned with embroidered flowers and her mother's pearl earrings. Around her neck hung Preston's locket, now containing a tiny photograph of Thomas on one side and a pressed wildflower from Preston on the other, past and present together, neither diminishing the other. As they spoke their vows before the gathered townsfolk, many of whom had not seen Virginia socialize in years, her voice rang clear and confident. This was not the desperate, clinging love of youth, but something deeper and more enduring, a love tempered by loss, strengthened by shared understanding, built on mutual respect and genuine friendship. "I never thought I'd find joy again," she told Preston as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "You didn't just help me fix my fences, you helped me mend my heart." Preston's arms tightened around her waist, his smile as steady and reassuring as the day they'd met. "And you showed me that a drifter could find home again, that the heart can expand to hold both grief and happiness." They returned to the homestead that evening, their homestead now, to find Duchess waiting imperiously on the porch, as if demanding an explanation for their absence. The orange tabby Preston had dubbed Foreman wound around their legs, purring a welcome home. "We should expand the house," Preston observed as they stood arm in arm, surveying their property in the golden light of sunset. "Add a proper bedroom, maybe a sitting room for when winter comes again." Virginia leaned against his solid strength, contentment warming her from within. "And a nursery, perhaps, for the future." Preston looked down at her, hope dawning in his eyes. A nursery would be fine planning indeed. As twilight softened the landscape, they stood together on land that had witnessed both their separate sorrows and their shared joy. The mountains remained steadfast in the distance. The seasons would continue their eternal cycle, and life with all its pain and beauty would unfold as it always had. But Virginia would face it no longer alone, her heart no longer closed against possibility. Instead, she would move forward with Preston beside her, his steady smile a daily reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, that love, when given a second chance, could flourish in the most unlikely soil. 2 years later, on another perfect spring day, Virginia sat on the expanded porch of their homestead, rocking their infant daughter in her arms. Sarah Elizabeth Nichols, named for the family Preston had lost, had her father's hazel eyes and her mother's determined spirit, a new beginning born from honored endings. Preston emerged from the barn, Foreman at his heels, his face lighting up at the sight of his wife and daughter. As he climbed the porch steps and leaned down to kiss them both, Virginia reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from grief so profound it had nearly consumed her to joy so complete it sometimes took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, settling beside her on the porch swing, one arm draped comfortably around her shoulders. Virginia smiled, leaning into his embrace. about closed hearts and steady smiles. About how sometimes the things we fear most letting people in, risking loss again, are exactly what we need to truly live. Preston's fingers gently stroked their daughter's downy head. "Any regrets?" "Not one," Virginia replied truthfully. "Every step of the path, even the painful ones, led me here. Led us here." As the sun began to set, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they sat together in contented silence, their shared future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western horizon. Virginia's once closed heart now beat strong and sure, not despite her past losses, but because of them, for they had taught her the true value of love found, lost, and miraculously found again.